Hi. All right, so we're gonna kick things off. Thank you to everybody who's joined, and thank you especially to the people who've joined all 4 of these so far, which is awesome. So for those of you just joining today for the first time, my name is Jess, and I'm the founder of a management consulting company called Sprezatura, which focuses on consulting as well as crisis management for customer first brands. And the origin story of Sprezatura was really after my experience as a founder. So I founded 3 companies in a variety of spaces, both tech, services, and after selling my 3rd company and working for the company that acquired us, I started to really think about what I needed as a founder that kind of spanned all of the companies. And one of the really core things that I always was frustrated with was the role of an outsourced CFO. And I always felt that outsourced CFOs that I had been working with were really more like glorified accountants who were reconciling my books, providing me with monthly reports, but were never really diving into my financials the way an actual CFO should. And so over time, after being an entrepreneur for 15 years, I started to really love the financial component of the business, and so decided to originally launch Sprezatura to focus on providing operational finance. So in addition to the accounting, reconciling your books, providing reports, and doing the taxes and board presentations, what we actually do is dive in with an operational hat to give you as a founder recommendations on what you could be doing in order to move you closer towards your long-term goals. And then we expanded upon those services to offer a business in a box service that works with founders who have ideas, and we take them from idea to launch in a 5-phase program. And then at the core of what we're really doing now, given the current climate, is crisis road mapping and recovery. And that's where we started to look at things from a financial and operational standpoint, and it was abundantly clear that the missing link there was someone who could focus on brand and marketing. Because even if we were giving recommendations on pushing back launches, if a brand isn't using this as an opportunity to communicate with their customers and potential customers in a way that's not tone deaf, but could use it as an opportunity, then it's really unfortunate. And so that's when we partnered with Anna, who I can sing her praises all day, but she is just a wizard with marketing and with brand, and is really working to offer holistic brand management throughout this crisis. So she kind of fills in that gap with brand and marketing, and I'll just pass it over to her so that she can talk a little bit about her background and what she does, and can give a little preview of what we're going to be chatting about today.
Great, thanks Jess for the lovely introduction, and the same way you were looking for someone with like brand and marketing expertise, I always sort of wanted, like always try to partner with finance and operations people, because for me it was not, the marketing that's not measurable doesn't really do anything. It's just you're just, I don't know, either building awareness without knowing, if it's not strategic, it's not working. So that is like, if you just do something for buzz building and making noise sake, which is a lot of like mindless actions that can like provide a short-term benefit to your brand, but how does that really impact your bottom line? How does that really impact how you operate? How does that impact how you're organized internally? And how does that impact your ability to really adapt to a crisis like this and how to pivot very quickly? That's something I've been doing in my entire career, even on the agency side, when you're looking at that holistic perspective, even when you're sort of offering a campaign, you say, but what does this mean in terms of who, like in terms of what you're doing, who is doing it, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it? What is that growth plan that really supports all of that? And that was especially true when I went on a brand side as the chief brand officer of Rebecca Minkoff and acting CMO at David Yurman and Mansur Gavriel until recently. That was just looking how to deploy the right resources and capabilities and right processes and structures for marketing to be approached more as an ongoing, integrated, holistic approach rather than something that's touch and go, touch and go, touch and go. And I think that this current situation made it even more obvious that you need something like that, because you have to cut budgets right now. People are not buying, and if you're in a business of services or products, you don't have demand. So what do you do when you don't have demand? How do you still stay in business? Well, you can't just like cut the entire budget. That's really not going to help you, because that means that you're not staying you're not maintaining a relationship with your customers. At the same time, you do need to cut expenses. So it's better to think about like how are all those different departments working together and how they can support each other. Right now, I probably don't need that awareness tactics. I don't need to spend as much money on a Google search keywords maybe at the moment, or so much on display, but what I do need to spend money, it's on customer relationship management and making sure that I retain the customers I already have. I don't need to spend on influencers right now. I don't need to spend on PR companies, on a retainer that keep those influencers working with me. I need to spend time on content. I probably need to spend time on some more of sustainable initiatives. I probably need to put my best foot forward to serve the community and see how I can activate my own employees, for example, and so on. So with that in mind, in this particular session, we are talking about the tone of voice, how to set the right tone of voice for the brand, and that
and today,
kind of
today is the visual language.
Today is a visual, not tone of voice. Okay, they're connected. So
yeah, they're the
they're like two sides of the same coin. So like when you're talking about visuals, I will start, and then when Court Williams joins us, then he can take it from there. So in terms of visuals, I'll take a step back and say, unless you have a very strong point of view as a brand and already established before now, it's going to be very hard to say, hey, this is uniquely ownable by me in terms of your visuals. Obviously, when you have a time when aspiration is a little bit dialed down, and people are not like, oh my God, I need to have that pair of sneakers, or I need to travel there, and I have a big fear of missing out. When fear of missing out is not there, that needs to be reflected in your visual content. And content that works right now really well is the real content. And it means like the real content is, oh, I'm at home in my in-laws house or in my own apartment, and I'm taking photos of my outfits on a hallway, and I'm taking photos of things that I'm cooking, or I'm taking like photos of the TV I'm watching, or I don't know, like yoga that I'm doing, like something that everyone can easily relate to. That also can be aspirational in a way, because that sort of caters to the sense of belonging. It just caters to a different motivation. And what we have been seeing with a lot of influencers is that they get the backlash if they work with brands that have been called out, or if they work with if they go outside and take photos of like being outside, because an influencer has wide reach. And all, like when they were selling us, like, I don't know, poop tea or a moon juice, like it's fine, no one cared, like whatever works for you. But when you're promoting socially responsible behavior, all of a sudden that all of us is kind of like, okay, what's going on? Because we all think no one thinks that influencers are real, really. They're just like these commercial tools and economic entities that brands use to promote their product. But at the same time, once they become members of a society, you're like, hey, why are you not hearing to the same things that we are? We are all the same, you know? And I think when it comes to visual language, what is really relevant there is once influencers don't have that, oh, I can go on a, like, I don't know, like a Kilimanjaro, or I can go travel here and there, then you're like us. So what makes you different in this moment? So I think it is very challenging if you're an influencer or if you have any sort of following as a brand to really say, hey, like, how do I differentiate through this content, all the while staying mindful of the current mood? Because like right now, the current mood is a communal mood, is supporting each other, is sort of just getting through this. It's not aspirational. And influencers are all about like, they're themselves centric. They're not customer centric or community centric at all. They're like, oh, it's all about me. And right now that doesn't really work in this climate. So Court, I just gave a little bit of a strategic background on this overall topic so you can dive into specifics. So for me, if I'm going to hand it over to you immediately, but for me, the biggest challenge is influencers always differentiated themselves because they had something that the rest of us couldn't have. If they right now present themselves as they're having something that we don't have, we call them out. But if they are the same as us, we're like, well, you're same as us. I have nothing to be jealous. Like I don't have anything to aspire to. So like in that context, can we see what the right visual language is?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I apologize to the room for being a bit late. I will definitely dive in and talk a bit about that. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here so that you guys can see what I'm seeing. Let's see here. Are you guys seeing the title screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, wonderful. Definitely diving into that kind of a contradiction or a conflict, if you will, for some influencers out there. It can be very challenging, and hopefully some of the things that we'll talk about today will start to break down what some of the tools are to building a visual language and exploring what your right visual language might be to try to help individuals find where they can fit in this modern context. Because obviously the biggest challenge is that there's no single solution. There's no one thing to say like, oh, well, if you just do this, then everything will be okay. The visual language solution is going to be very different from person to person, target audience to target audience, objective to objective. And so what I wanted to do with this conversation today, building off of the conversation we had last week, is just kind of talk about some of the tools that people actually have to explore what visual language is. And then I think when we go into the Q&A at the end, maybe some people will have specific questions about their situations where we might be able to dive into that conflict you were just highlighting, Anna. So just to kind of like start off, and some people may be tuning in again from last week, and some people might be new, as maybe your first call. So I'll start off by introducing myself again. My name's Cork, and I am a creative director, a digital creative director, and I'm a part of the creative shop at Facebook. I spend most of my time working on the Instagram brand, even though we are a bit platform agnostic, just because my vertical is luxury fashion. So I work with the global luxury fashion brands on building their advertising campaigns and digital personality across Facebook's suite of apps. That being said, I am here speaking to you pretty much from my POV. This isn't a Facebook sponsored broadcast or anything like that. We're having real talk here. So everything.
It's real. Oh, can I just say something? Like, do you see? Like, speaking of visual language, I dressed up.
I do see.
I'm wearing jeans. I have sneakers on.
I love. We were channeling each other today with the denim vibes.
Sorry, go on.
I love it. I love it. So yeah, we're doing real talk. We're chilling out today, and I encourage you guys to be thinking of questions that you can ask me. Just kind of tap into just my 20 years of experience as a creative director, brand builder, image builder, as we go through this presentation. I think the first thing to understand, just to kind of try to simplify it, obviously, when you're talking about visual language, we could all sit here and talk about this for like days on end, and like all of us would have different opinions, and we'd all have different ways of approaching things, and we could just go on, and it would be such a rich conversation. But for the sake of a 30 to 45-minute discussion, I think we should think about the concept of discovering or finding your visual language in two parts. There's kind of two parts to the process. The first thing you're going to want to do is construct your visual language. And that's going to be a little bit of research and soul searching, a little bit of looking at some of the intersections between who you are and what's happening out in the world. And I think the second part of it then is going to be communicating with your visual language. And I want to highlight there that I say communicating with your visual language, because one of the big hangups that a lot of brands, whether they be personal brands or corporate level brands, one of the big hangups that they have, or one of the issues they run into, is that they try to communicate their visual language. And your visual language is apparent. It is the wrapper. It's the surface. You don't need to communicate your visual language. You need to have something deeper than that to say. So the idea is figuring out how to communicate with your visual language. What are the tools inside your visual language that you're going to use to communicate the things you want to communicate? So starting with constructing your visual language, I think the simplest questions to start with, and again, this list can be 15 questions long once you start really breaking out each one of these and how deep you can go into thinking about them. But the main questions are: what matters to you? Who do you want to reach, and what matters to them? I think at a base level, starting there and figuring that out and understanding that at its core is going to help you out with your visual language. And here's a little bit of what I mean. Looking at what matters to you and why that has an impact on your visual language, I wanted to pull some examples from digital content from some of the brands that we're the most familiar with, probably the people on the call. So this is just a random selection of stuff that I pulled from Coca-Cola's digital channels. And obviously from this content, it's clear that happiness matters to Coca-Cola, right? And they're communicating that in several different ways, just in what you can see from the visual. The same thing when you go to Apple, pulling content from Apple's digital channels. You might expect to see a bunch of computers, but you don't. You see a bunch of really kind of high art. So that lets you know the design is really, really important to Apple, purely from the visual language that they've established for themselves across their digital channels. And then tapping into the fashion space, looking at a brand like Vetements, it's super, super clear that disruption is very important to them. From taking something like a very welcoming statements like "thank you" and "have a nice day," but putting a middle finger in the middle of them, to gender bending, or taking things that are traditionally ugly like a dirty bathroom and positioning them as a luxury fashion environment. It's all about disruption, and all of those things are in their visual language and consistent for all of those brands. And so when you start to look at who do these people intend to reach with these messages, I think it starts to be quite clear, and I think it looks quite familiar to us because we know these brands. We know that Coca-Cola is a entertainment and family brand. And obviously happiness plugs very clearly and very easily into that conversation and resonates with those audiences. Entertainment probably being a very broad audience, but it is also a very broad kind of umbrella type of brand. With Apple being a little bit more curated, their approach really is going after the creator community, the creator class. And we all, obviously, as creators, know that we use a lot of Apple products. The creative industries, more so than, say, the financial industries, for instance, rely on Apple products. And they're reaching out to that community directly in their visual language. They understand that that's who they want to reach and who they need to proselytize and keep engaged. And lastly, with Vetements, it's the same thing. These are really, really high-end, very expensive items of clothing, but they're targeted to a group of people who are a bit, I guess, for want of a better term, looking for a more relaxed form of luxury. They don't want to feel like the fact that they can afford nice things means they have to look a certain way or conform to a certain identity. That way of disrupting luxury or disrupting the status quo is something that's intrinsic to that consumer. And therefore, that's exactly what the brand looks like. So I think a lot of times when people look at visual identities, it can come across like, oh, there's this, creative director sitting in an ivory tower, and this is just what they like to do. And oh, good for that person. They looked up, and the rest of the world also likes what they like. And while that does happen sometimes, it's not the way it happens most of the time. A lot of times, these experienced creative directors and brand directors and design directors do a lot of research about, yes, what's important to them, because they are the guide, they are the original inspiration, but then also doing that Venn diagram to see where it overlaps with who they want to reach and what matters to them. Understanding what matters to that audience and making sure that that's all taken into account when developing that visual language becomes super, super important. So once you've kind of done that high level thinking about what matters to you, who you're actually trying to talk to and what matters to them, and find out, have an idea conceptually about what actually needs to be communicated, what you need to be showing, and how you need to show up on digital channels. There's a couple of tools, a couple of levers that you can pull to get there. And I think we saw a lot of that. We saw these tools in the content from Apple, from Vetements, and also from Coca-Cola. But again, unless you're really looking at it and thinking about it with a critical eye toward visual language or Viz ID, as some people call it, some of these things kind of blur together and you just kind of get the brunt impact of it. So I just wanted to pull these out and show examples of each one of them so you understand a little bit better what the tools are you have to affect that narrative once you put a visual out there. The first one obviously is production. And I started with production because it's a very interesting space right now. With apps like TikTok becoming more and more popular and the visual style of TikTok becoming more and more popular, what TikTok is doing is actually kind of merging together two visual languages that were popularized on earlier social media platforms like Instagram and Facebook. Facebook was a very real platform. It was photos of your family, photos of you going about your day, that sort of thing. And then Instagram came about and kind of upgraded that a bit and gave birth to what people often call the Instagram aesthetic, this kind of curated, almost editorial vibe to social media content that looked a little bit more polished and a little bit more produced. Even toward recent times on Instagram, we started to see a younger generation of people kind of revolt against that like premium kind of pristine look, kind of revolt against the filters, revolt against the special effects, revolt against the editing, and they started to mix into the streams on even on Instagram a more verite approach to their visual content. And then you come to TikTok, the new kid on the block who's super, super powerful and growing right now. And TikTok has merged those two worlds. You've got content that looks like it's made at home, but uses a lot of very sophisticated post-production techniques like quick cuts and overlays and face filters, but not in order to make the content look somehow more professional. It's more so to just enhance the excitement and energy behind the content. So thinking about production and what type of vibe you want to communicate becomes very important today, because people are going to see your content and likely assign you to one of those tribes. Are you one of the originals where it's kind of like, this is a day in my life and it's literally like my social media photo that's put up? Some people really appreciate that, and they see that as being quite real and authentic in a way that they hunger for on digital platforms. Then there's the middle group that is a little bit more of the polished kind of social media aesthetic, like again the Instagram look, and there are a lot of people that are more comfortable with that because they like to see that aspirational image. They like to see that someone is putting in a bit of effort behind the content. It feels to them like someone's putting more effort behind their content when it looks like that. It looks more curated. And then lastly, this new area where those two things have been kind of slammed together, where you've got these special effects and overlays, but on top of content that is quite verite. All of those things are quite important to consider when you're thinking about the production of your content and what you ultimately want it to look like. Then obviously you have your colors and filters, and filters not to be confused with overlays and effects. Filters are things that impact color and balance, the depth of the image, things like that. And I've pulled here a friend of mine, a lady named Ashley, who has a blog called Closet Vomit. And Ashley, I've always appreciated her approach to colors and filters. She uses a very kind of almost a sepia tone, muted kind of color palette in all of her images. And it kind of stitches everything together, even though her images are very much about her life and cover several different topics. Sometimes it's fashion, sometimes it's decorating, sometimes it's lifestyle. But those filters really stitch everything together so that everything feels very, very Ashley. And I think it's important to think about this when you're designing your visual identity, because filters are such a prominent part of social media. Again, just like when you look at Vetements content or look at Apple's content or Coca-Cola's content, people will make assumptions about who you are and what you stand for based on these visuals. Obviously, this warm kind of a tone makes people feel a little bit more approachable, which is exactly what Ashley kind of wanted. She's a very like, what's the word I'm looking for? She has a very strong personality, and she's a very strong aesthetic with this very kind of severe haircut. It's very dark, and she's very pale. She's a stunning person in person, and that can lead to people being a bit intimidating. And so she's countering that by using this warm and approachable filter. Some people use cooler tones because cooler colors tend to look a little bit more sharp and crisp. And definitely when you're looking at, we'll see in the next slide, thinking about like balance and depth to the image, all of those things go into how people perceive your brand to be. I'm throwing my content in there again, shameless plug, right? But no, I'm talking, using my content to talk about lighting, because I have a relatively specific approach to lighting in my images. And that means in post-production as well as lighting in person, like when you're actually setting up a shot. I tend to prefer very kind of bright brights and very, very deep dark blacks, a very high contrast kind of image. And as you can see from this before and after video that I posted here, the shots that I take initially don't always come across that way. Sometimes the shots that I take initially are quite flat, where the brights are not particularly bright and the darks are kind of muddy. And I just fix that in post-production so that all of my images kind of have that contrasty texture to them. And again, I also use cooler filters. You can see from that when we were referencing from the first slide, the before image is a lot warmer feeling than the after image, just because I like for my pictures to be a little bit more sharp, maybe a little bit less approachable than Ashley does. But again, super, super important to think about that. What is your lighting saying about you? I think a photographer that might be familiar to all of us, where it's very clear the role that lighting plays in establishing an identity, is Jürgen Teller. Everyone knows Jürgen Teller's style, even though he shoots in a lot of different styles. You'd be surprised if you dive into the nether regions of the internet and find all of the work that he's done. The style that he's famous for is this very like overexposed, kind of blown out vibe that he shot for Marc Jacobs and several other brands. But that's just an idea that gives you an idea of how important just your lighting effect, your lighting technique can be in establishing a visual identity for the broader public. And then composition obviously is super important. I think that when we think about visual identity, composition is one of those things that people regularly consider. But I think that people think about it tend to think about it in very surface ways, right? Composition can be, can involve a layout. If you're talking about a magazine, you can be talking about the composition of an entire spread with several pieces of content in it. But you can also be talking about more frequently the composition inside an image. And I wanted to highlight for this one, this amazing fashion photographer, Valentin Erfray, is based in Paris. Amazing guy, he's good friends with Demna, does a lot of work for Balenciaga and for Vetements. But he really, really uses alternative compositions to either show the passage of time in a single static image versus jumping over to video, or he uses fisheye and wide angle lenses to really draw attention in a composition to specific elements. So like on the left, what you see here obviously is an image of a male model who walks into frame from the left, turns to face center in the middle, and then walks out and walks into frame from the right. If you saw a video, there would be a quick cut where he walks in, poses, walks out, and then walks in. But what Valentin did was actually splice those moments together so that you're able to see all of that action, highlight the product, which is the sweater, the pants, and the bag, all in a static image, instead of having it be a video where if you only catch part of the video, you only see some of the action or some of the items. That compositional element is really helpful to actually show the products that the brand is trying to show in this particular image. And this is something that he does regularly. This is a hallmark of Valentin Airfray's style, this kind of like slicing to show different moments in time and to show an object moving through space. And then on the right, you have an example where he's used a fisheye lens to really, really exaggerate the length of that pointed toe on the shoe. Which again, you're really using it not just because, oh, I like fisheye lenses. I mean, here he's using it to highlight specifically an item in a collection. And again, if you go to his Instagram page, you'll see different ways that he uses that fisheye lens. Here he's using it to highlight this shoe that's kind of at the edges of the composition. But in other times, he uses it to actually draw out the head of a person in the center of a composition. It's really interesting to see how he, actually this may be a wide angle. He uses the fisheye lens to draw out the size of like a head or a focal point in the center, and then a wide angle to like exaggerate the edges of an image, the way he's done here. And then lastly, it's motion and choreography. Obviously, we know that motion content is where it's at. And TikTok, I think, and the popularity of TikTok is a further testament to that. For so long, digital content was all about static images, and it was very difficult to actually get motion content out unless you were like a really high-end brand or a big production company. And now for the last maybe 5 or 6 years, video has been it, so motion becomes very important in what type of motion you're using, and also the choreography of that motion. And when I say choreography, I'm not talking about dance moves like we actually see on the right here, like and understanding dance techniques, but more so the choreography of your cuts. So the two different types of choreography we're seeing here on the left, we have a choreography that is a continuous shot, really, and actually is probably all entirely constructed in post-production. This was probably something that was retrofitted from a static image, and then they used motion graphics or motion animation to actually create the movement in this image. It's a single shot that slowly pans in on that logo. Whereas on the right, the choreography is a bunch of quick cuts and it's much more rhythmic. Those things are very much a part of visual identity. Whether your brand is a little bit more reflective and somber, or your campaign or you as a person are more reflective, versus whether or not you're about high energy and about, again, this kind of brightness comes across when you use content that has different moves, the way these two pieces have different moves. So just looking at those tools, I think it's clear that you can use any of those things in any different combination, any different order, to really craft a visual brand or a visual identity, vis-a-vis that communicates who you are. And as you're trying to figure out what unique combination of tactics and techniques to use across those things, you'll be taking into consideration not only what you want to say, but also taking into consideration who you're talking to and what those people are most interested in hearing. Because that's what's gonna ultimately, that's the alchemy that's ultimately gonna help you solve that problem of how to cut through in kind of the uncertain times that we're in now. So I'm wrapping up my presentation part, and we're gonna go into some questions and answers here. Just wanted to remind you guys to feel free to follow me at @VCourtWilliams on Instagram, because you can ask me questions here, but as well as we go, I like to make new friends and meet new people. So after this ends, if a question pops up in your mind, feel free to just DM me over a question. and I'll write back and see if I can help you guys out with any problems. But of course, we're going to open up now to take questions here via the chat function if you guys want. Stop sharing my screen. And then we can chat. Let's see, there are questions. Yeah, I'm gonna check my DMs too and see if there's any questions coming in here. You guys are shy this time. Oh, wait, looks like some conversations are coming in. Oh, thanks. It's nice to leave. Thanks so much for coming. There's one question coming in here. Can you talk about the type of visuals that a services company should use since they can't focus on products in their feed? Absolutely, absolutely. That's a very good question. A company that's focused on services may actually lean a lot more toward text-based imagery, because really the most important thing for a service-based company is to talk about value propositions. Obviously, with products, it helps to talk about the value proposition of a product, but especially in fashion, sometimes it's not always necessary. You may just lean on the aesthetic, but if you're providing a service, you're going to be operating much more at a consideration phase. Why should people use your service more than any other service? Unless you're a very unique company and performing a service that no one else is performing, which I think it's hard to do in this day and age where everything is available to everyone. I think the visuals that you would want to lean on are going to be, again, motion graphics to highlight your value propositions, and still thinking about what are the images that give what we call category cues. So category cues are images that may not be specifically of your product or even specifically of you, but denote or connote your industry or the space that you operate in. For instance, you can look at a photograph of a forest for a nature conservancy. You don't need to have a photograph of the staff at the nature conservancy or a photograph of the offices or something like that. Any shot that looks beautiful and natural is going to trigger to people, this is something about the environment. Using the color green is another one of those things that's kind of a category cue. So you're going to want to lean on category cues, maybe even leaning into some of the stock footage that's available out there. Stock footage is a very touchy subject from an aesthetic point of view, just because it can be quite low quality. But I would encourage people to actually look at some of the stock sites that are more editorialized, to maybe buy some content that you can use if you're a services company. And then in between those, use some of your thought leadership to position the value proposition for your services using text animation overlays or kind of like those inspiration text cards in content. I have a question here. How do you decide which channels to start with when your audience is on all the big ones? And how much content do you take to producing to start? That is a good question. That's a little bit more along the lines of content strategy. I think that it's important for brands to obviously start your strategy in a relatively non-aesthetic place. And to start thinking about like what business goals you need to accomplish, because I think all of those questions are going to questions are going to follow kind of what your business development plan is. Some companies, for example, very much believe in a organic first approach. They want to do groundswell. They want to build a community around their products and then go into kind of promoting out the product massively. There are other brands, especially some direct to consumer brands, depending on what your rounds of funding look like, who really just dive straight into mass distribution and paid content. Those two strategies have very different approaches to content development and production. production. Obviously, if you're going the more organic route, you're going to have to produce a little bit more content because the distribution is not guaranteed. If you're talking organic distribution, you're going to be at the whim of all of those digital platforms algorithms, whether you're talking about content you're putting on Instagram, TikTok, whatever it may be. You're going to be at the mercy of an algorithm with organic content. So that means you have to produce a little bit more content to stay in front of people. And you're also going to be doing on the back end a lot more direct relationship building. And it will behoove you to kind of show those relationships in that content. That's one strategy there. The other strategy for some DTC brands of going, kind of balls to the wall, hardcore paid advertising to start, means they actually don't have to produce very much content. Obviously, if they're selling a product or service, they need some sort of point of sale that they can drive people to using the ads. But for advertising, for paid advertising to be effective, you don't actually need a lot of different kinds of content. You actually need fewer but higher quality types of content. And when I say higher quality, I don't mean production. I mean higher quality, I mean as in communicating a clear call to action. If you want people to buy something, like clearly say buy. Don't take a beautiful picture of the box and send it out and assume people are going to understand that you want them to shop. So yeah, I would love to talk, the person who asked that question, I would love to talk a little bit more deeply about that, just because I think it's a bigger question than BizID. It has a lot more to do with what your particular strategy is for business growth. So feel free to IM me and we'll continue that conversation. What brands do I admire for visual communications? Oh my goodness, there's so many of them. There's so many of them. I mean, I think I included Apple in this because I think Apple is just stunning. The work that they do is really great, especially for them being a tech company. They kind of put themselves in the same space as a premium brand or a design brand, which I think is really smart and really interesting for them. Fashion wise, I mean, I think fashion is the wild, wild west right now. So I think, anything I say in that space is going to be highly subjective. But I definitely appreciate what some of the more disruptive brands are doing. Again, I highlighted last conversation, Bottega Veneta. I do think that what Daniel Lee is doing over there right now is kind of disruptive. It's starting to become a little bit copied, and you're seeing it a little bit more. But when he first came in there, what he was doing was quite disruptive, and some of the types of photography that he was doing there was really, really interesting and caught people's eye, as is reflected in Bottega's business performance as well. I would also say don't come for me, but I still like what Gucci does. I mean, I can't say that I dislike Alessandro's aesthetic. Again, looking at that equation of what's important to you, who do you want to talk to, and what's important to them. I think the question is whether or not that sort of surreal, kind of a weird aesthetic, that kind of not nerd culture, but almost this kind of a subculture premium aesthetic, whether or not that can be sustained as that group of people they talk to continue to evolve and different trends kind of pass through remains to be seen. But I still like on surface value the aesthetic that Alessandro has built at Gucci. Would it be possible to share your slides afterwards with us? Probably not. The only reason is because I've included some content from other accounts there. And so it would be easier probably if you have any questions to just DM me. I wouldn't want to send out without those accounts' permission any of the slides here that we've shared with you guys. But feel free again to DM me any questions that you have, and I can give you references, and you can check out some of the accounts maybe yourself. Once the direction is planned for the brand, can you put value on where you think is more important to post the content, on IG stories or in the main feed, or does one drive the other? That is interesting. That also, I think, is a little bit more of a content strategy question, and it depends on who your target audience is. I think that all surfaces of any platform should be used. I know recently there was a lot of discussion around how to use the For You page in TikTok because people were hashtagging everything for you, and eventually, because so many people tagged everything for you, it meant the For You page was no longer a great way to get discovered because there's so much content there. IG faces similar situations when you're building content and putting content organically on Instagram. There are certainly, if you're talking about paid content, there are certainly fewer people playing on Instagram stories than there are playing in feed. So that's one thing to consider. But really, it has to do with your content strategy as to whether or not you're going to be a brand that communicates primarily via ephemeral content on stories or via more permanent content on feed. I would say if you have the capacity and you're not deciding between the two, the best thing to do obviously is to play in both spaces and to have a different way of communicating in those different environments. You might think of stories very much like and this goes for everything, stories on Facebook, stories on Instagram, even when you're talking about your strategy for Snapchat, any sort of ephemeral content platform, you may think about that much more the way you would think about wheat pasting on a street. Because a consumer can walk past it and they can kind of go back and look at it if they want. They can stand there and look for a while, they can pause it, or they can keep on and go on about their business. Whereas with feed, the behavior really is, I mean, people can do that, but with feed, the behavior really is to kind of fly through content and you stop and double tap and you kind of keep going. So feed is much more kind of like a highway, looking at billboards on a highway. You can't like shift your car into reverse on a highway. So as a brand, you kind of want to catch people while they're casually shopping and walking down the street, which is more of a stories environment, and you want to be able to remind them that you're there when they're driving down the highway. So if you have the capacity, doing both makes most sense. Let's see. How do you balance the constant buy now posts with real life posts? Should you mesh the two, or should you keep business as business? That actually we're going to cover next week. That's a little bit about tone of voice and balancing out how salesy you are versus how inspirational you are, how lifestyle you are. So just so I get to other questions, definitely tune in on Thursday though. Not next week, it's on Thursday. We're gonna talk about tone of voice and like messaging and what you should be saying and how you should be saying it. So don't wanna lose that question. Just wanna address it after we've had that discussion. If I want to level up my motion and choreography skills to evolve more in third evolution of digital content you mentioned, what software or tools do you advise right now? Good question, good question. I think that if you have the time to really dive into it, you definitely want to be looking at Premiere and for editing and things. You want to look at a lot of mobile tools. I think as an individual are actually a better way to get into content for your personal social media. Premiere Rush is the mobile version of Adobe Premiere, and you can do some motion. Obviously, it's primarily an editing tool, but you can do some motion animation with that. But again, it's because it's primarily an editing tool that'll get you into a space where you can do some of those quick cut between really cool shots that do different things and have different conflicting motions that'll keep the eye really engaged. Also, using tools like, I actually think some of the native tools inside TikTok are great. One of the most brilliant things that TikTok ever did was allow you to easily share content off of platforms, so people can really use TikTok, the platform, as an editing tool. They have so many special effects that like it would take someone forever to learn how to use to create as a flame artist or something like that. So I would say definitely experiment with building things inside TikTok and exporting them. There's another app called Image Play Pro that I use a lot to build things like boomerangs and GIFs. That can be really fun. Again, there's a lot of them. So maybe it'd be great if you could also DM me, because I have a list of probably, I would say like 10 different mobile apps and some desktop-based apps, if you really want to lean into it, that I could recommend for upping your kind of motion choreography game. Let's see, any questions that I missed on here? It looks like we're good. It looks like we're good. So thank you guys so much again for joining us. Again, like I said, that question that was about tone and about like how salesy to be and balancing out like buy now, please come back on Thursday because we're going to be talking about tone of voice and some of those messaging points then. Or if you'd like, if you're not available Thursday, feel free to DM me and we can chat about it as buddies.
Awesome. That was amazing. I literally just filled up an entire notebook with notes. You're an absolute genius, and we're so grateful for you sharing all of your knowledge with us. And we couldn't be more excited for Thursday. So if you are signed up, then we can't wait to see you again. If you're not, you can find the links to sign up. The full calendar of webinars for Lunch and Learns is at the bottom of the Sprezzatura homepage, sprezzatura.inc.com, or if you go to the Sprezzatura Inc. Instagram, there's the link in the bio to sign up for Thursday, which is again at 12:30, and Court will be doing part 2, talking through tone of voice, which will be equally as enthralling as today. And yeah, I'm so excited, and this was great. Thank you so much, Court. I really appreciate this.
Absolutely. I'll talk to you soon, Jess.
All right. Bye.